Welcome to Channel 4 News. We have an exciting news broadcast for you tonight, and I hope you enjoy. On April 30th, 1970, President Richard M. Nixon appeared on national television to announce the invasion of Cambodia by the United States and needs to draft 150,000 more soldiers for an expansion of the Vietnam War effort. This has recently provoked massive protests on campuses throughout the country. At Kent State University in Ohio, protesters launched a demonstration that included setting fire to a ROTC building, prompting the governor of Ohio to dispatch 900 National Guardsmen to the campus. During an altercation on May 4th, 20 guardsmen opened fire on a crowd, killing 4 students and wounding 9. Yes, you heard correctly, wounding 9, and killing 4. Despite the public outcry, the Justice Department initially declined to conduct a grand jury investigation. A report by the President's Commission on Campus Unrest did acknowledge, however, that the action of the guardsmen had been unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. Eventually, a grand jury indicted 8 of the guardsmen, but the charges were dropped because of lack of evidence.
The Pentagon Papers was the name given to the secret Department of Defense study of U.S. political and military involvement in the Vietnam War from 1945 to 1967, prepared at the request of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967. As the Vietnam War dragged on and the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam increased to more than 500,000 troops by 1968, the military analyst Daniel Ellsberg came to oppose the war and decided that the information contained in the Pentagon Papers should be more widely available to the American public. He secretly photocopied the report and in March of 1971 gave the copy to the New York Times, which subsequently published a series of articles based on the report's findings. Amid the national and international uproar that followed, the federal government tried unsuccessfully to block publications of the Pentagon Papers on grounds of national security.
Early on the morning of June 17, 1972, several burglars were arrested inside the office of the Democratic National Committee, located in the Watergate building in Washington, D.C. This was no ordinary robbery. The prowlers were connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, and they had been caught while attempting to wiretap phones and steal secret documents. While historians are not sure whether Nixon knew about the Watergate espionage operation before it happened, he took steps to cover it up afterwards, raising hush money for burglars trying to stop the FBI from investigating the crime, destroying evidence, and firing uncooperative staff members. In August 1974, after his role in the Watergate conspiracy had finally come to light, the president resigned. His successor, Gerald Ford, immediately pardoned Nixon for all of the crimes he committed or may have committed while in office.
President Richard Nixon visits the People's Republic of China. After arriving in Beijing, the president announced that his breakthrough visit to China is the week that changed the world. In meeting with Nixon, Prime Minister Zhou Enlai urged early peace in Vietnam, but did not endorse North Vietnam's political demands. North Vietnamese officials and peace negotiators took a dim view of Nixon's trip, fearing that China and the United States would make a deal behind their backs. Nixon's promise to reduce the U.S. military presence in Taiwan seemed to confront North Vietnamese fears of a Chinese-American sellout treaty. U.S. military reduction in Taiwan for peace in Vietnam. Despite Hanoi's fears, China continued to supply North Vietnam levels of aid that had increased significantly in late 1971. The aid permitted the North Vietnamese to launch a major new offensive in March of 1972. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, implements what it calls an oil diplomacy. On this day in October of 1973, it prohibits any nation that has supported Israel in its Yom Kippur War with Egypt, Syria, and Jordan from buying any of the oil it sells. The ensuing energy crisis marked the end of an era of cheap gasoline and caused the share value of the New York Stock Exchange to drop by $97 billion. This in turn ushered in one of the worst recessions the United States have ever seen.
The official bicentennial events began April 1st, 1975, when the American Freedom Train launched in Wilmington, Delaware to start its 21-month, 25,388-mile tour of the 48 contiguous states. On April 18, 1975, President Gerald Ford traveled to Boston to light a third lantern at the historic Old North Church, symbolizing America's third century. The next day, Ford delivered a major address commemorating the 200th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, which began the military aspect of American Revolution against the British colonial rule.
On November 4th of 1979, a group of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking more than 60 American hostages. Holding the hostages was a dramatic way for the student revolutionaries to declare a break with Iran's past and end an American interference in its affairs. The students set their hostages free on January 21st, 1981, 444 days after the crisis began and just hours after President Ronald Reagan delivered his inaugural address. Many historians believe the hostage crisis cost Jimmy Carter a second term as president. Detente is the name given to the period of improved relations between the United States and the Soviet Union that began tentatively in 1971 and took decisive form when President Richard M. Nixon visited the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party, Leonid I. Brezhnev, in Moscow, May 1972.
The SALT II agreement was the result of many nagging issues left over from the successful SALT I Treaty of 1972. Though the 1972 treaty limited a wide variety of nuclear weapons, many issues remained unsolved. Talks between the United States and Soviet Union began almost immediately after the SALT I was ratified by both nations in 1972. For the United States, fear that the Soviets were leaping ahead in the arms race was a primary motivator. For the Soviet Union, the increasingly close relationship between America and Communist China was a cause of growing concern. During a summit meeting in Vienna, President Jimmy Carter and Soviet Union Leonid Brezhnev signed the SALT II agreement dealing with limitations and guidelines for nuclear weapons. The treaty, which never formally went into effect, proved to be one of the most controversial U.S.-Soviet agreements of the Cold War. At the White House in Washington, D.C., Egyptian President Anwar al-Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed the Camp David Accords, laying the groundwork for a permanent peace agreement between Egypt and Israel after 3 decades of hostilities. The accords were negotiated during 12 days of intensive talks at President Jimmy Carter's Camp David retreat in Catoctin Mountains in Maryland. The final peace agreement, the first between Israel and one of its Arab neighbors, was signed in March 1979. Sadat and Begin were jointly awarded the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for their efforts.